his various administrative problems. So anyway, that was one of the things he was interested in. And so we went off to McMaster, spent time in the West, and then during World War I, he went off to fight World War I, and all the Baptists at McMaster all went off together as a group. They enlisted en masse, went off to serve in Europe in the First World War, so there was quite a community of them. And then during the war, Innis was injured. He had suffered what was called a blighty, which is an injury that's bad enough to not really cripple you for life, but powerful enough to keep you out of battle. And so he was no longer fighting after that, was convalescing, did a degree through the Catholic College in Education, wrote a thesis on the returning soldier and the plight of the returning soldier to Canada and the US. And then he enrolled at the University of Toronto and did a PhD in political economy, wrote his thesis on the history of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, got a job at the University of Toronto, 1920, and then stayed there the rest of his life. So that part's easy. I don't have to talk about big transitions there. So 1920, Department of Political Economy, until he died in 1952, basically. So just to sum up very briefly, his early research was on staples, not the kind that are in staplers, but rather staples as products from the land or from mining that are natural resources: fish, fur, cod, wheat. Jim, any others spring to mind? Mining?
Mining.
Mining, of course. All these things, we saw this was the base of the economy in Canada, were the production of staples, a staple industry. So wrote a couple of very big books on staples, and then other contributions, a big book on the fur trade, another book on the industry of the fur trade that people don't know about so much, a big book on the cod fishery, and then various contributions on mining, on wheat, on settlement, on transportation. And then around 1940, he became interested in communication. There's a lot of dispute about, well, why did this person who was doing all this stuff on Canadian economic history suddenly become interested in global history, looking at communication on a world scale? And it's not entirely clear, but he became more interested in the media and their effects. But I think you can understand some of it by virtue of this project we're going to talk about, which is the History of Communications Project. So in the last 12 years of his life then, he was working a lot on communications, and he published a number of major works. One was called Empire of Communications, which basically was a series of lectures that he gave at Oxford in 1948, called the BEIT Lectures, B-E-I-T Lectures. He was invited to speak about some aspect of history of the British Commonwealth, but he didn't do that. He talked about kind of global history of communication, and they were a bit taken aback by that. He got his money all the same, and they paid him. And then he published the lectures as Empire of Communications. And then he published another major work called The Bias of Communication, which is basically a set of essays that he wrote in the late 1940s about media and communications. One essay is, the portmanteau essay is called The Bias of Communication. Another one was called The Nervous Owl. There are others as well. So these two main works came out 1950, 1951. And at that time he became Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Toronto, and became chair of the Transportation Committee, which is looking at transportation in Canada, which took its toll on him, and he was very ill the last couple of years of his life, and he died of cancer in 1952 at the age of 58, so relatively young. So anyway, that's his biography in a capsule. So what was this History of Communications project? Well, during the 1940s, Innis put together this huge manuscript on the history of communications. And part of it was taken out, and it became the basis for the Empire of Communications lectures, right? The BEIT Lectures became Empire of Communications, which is why the manuscript starts at chapter 4. So it's a chapter 4, and you start at chapter 4, where's 1 and 3? Well, you pull up 1 and 3 for Empire of Communications, basically. And And so you have this huge manuscript, 1,400 pages, sprawling all over the place, but a lot of detail. He wrote this in the 1940s, and he seemed to be making more progress on it in the mid-1940s. And basically, it was a examination of communication media from antiquity to the 20th century, but with a particular emphasis upon paper and parchment and papyrus, I guess the three big P's. Not so much on printing, but rather on these three media, you would say. Paper, right? So how did he come to this particular point? Well, one of the answers was, well, it had to do with the fact that he was interested in one of the staple industries, which was pulp and paper, all right? And I was skeptical about it. I thought, what's the connection, you know? It's, so what? But I started looking at the archives, and actually it was true. So I sort of refuted on that one. So basically, among the things he was looking at was the pulp and paper industry in Canada. And he was doing a fair bit of work in the late 1920s on pulp and paper particularly. Now, he was teaching a graduate seminar, I guess along the lines of your graduate seminars. And actually it was an undergraduate seminar. And this was very interesting because it was a course in commerce, which are designed to help the movers and shakers of industry, right, get an education and go off and become captains of industry. So it was meant for the final year commerce course. They had a special seminar in which they would do a special thesis, like a short thesis on a particular subject. So Innis, quite cleverly, took advantage of this. And he would organize a seminar around a particular subject every year of interest to him. So he did one on the fur trade, and basically they'd come into the class, first class, and he would give them a list. And he said, well, here's the topics for the course on the fur trade. And you choose one, and you write a thesis on it. I mean, those are the days when students knew their place. Right? So this is the topic, this is the theme. Here's your choice. You can do marketing of the fur trade. You can do international fur trade. You can do fur farming, whatever. So basically, they all got together, and then they would write their theses. And to help this, then he would travel around and get resources for them. So that's why he would go up north and get all these resources about the fur trade, and then bring them back, and then help the students do their research. And then also get material from the federal government to help the class along. Get them maps, and get them data, get them statistics, all feeding into this course. So anyway, he did this with pulp and paper as well. And then, to that end, he would travel around northern Ontario, and then doing his field research, what some people call dirt research. And he'd be basically visiting, you know, pulp and paper mills. So you might be interested in some excerpts here, where he would say, for instance, in his letters, he'd talk about what he was doing. You know, Innis to mother-in-law, like we'd go to mother, and then the rest would get the letter, I guess. I have done nothing but go through sawmills and paper pulp mills since I saw you, and since I last wrote. It has been very hard work. I walked at least 10 miles through mills yesterday, but it is what I need. I shall get into shape with this exercise, and I'm feeling fine, a little tired. Right? Another one here. A.T. Cook, engineer in charge, Department of Records, Price Brothers and Company, Lieutenant, Limited, Head Offices, Concordia, Quebec, Innis, July 6, 1927. Enclosed, a print of the general flow chart for our mills at Concordia, outlining the procedure of the manufacture of newsprint, for in accordance with your request during your recent visit to this plant, right? So he was doing this kind of work and accumulating the stuff about pulp and paper with the idea of producing a major staples work along the lines of the fur trade with the cod fishery, but about pulp and paper. So anyway, he took this into the 30s and was working on it, and was going to originally do it jointly with one of his junior colleagues, a woman by the name of Irene Biss, who was an economic historian from Britain, from Cambridge, by way of Bryn Mawr, who was teaching in the department, who actually became Innis's PhD student. And so they were going to do this work together on the pulp and paper industry, where he's going to do the pulp and paper she's going to do the energy. So she's going to be the energy expert, right? Because you need energy for pulp and paper, right? It takes a lot of energy to make pulp and paper. And then you get all this water in Canada that's flowing, and then you can use it to power the plant. So anyway, that was going to be her part. But anyway, Irene Biss suddenly decided she was offered a marriage proposal by a man named Graham Spry, who was quite active as a lobbyist on behalf of public radio in Canada. And so she got married, and because she was married, she could no longer teach, and that was the rule at the time. So she left the department and got married, leaving Innis in the lurch, as it were, and he was quite, I think, bitter about that. He said, "What happened to my partner here?" And there's a biography of Innis that claims that, in fact, he was in love with her, but I won't go there. I don't know. I have no evidence that that was the case. In any event, there goes the pulp and paper project. What happened was he continued on, and in the 1940s, he started to think about pulp and paper more globally. For whatever reason, I think he started to see the importance of paper and print in civilization. So he started to paint on a broader canvas than this. Well, what's the connection? I mean, how can I say there's a connection between the two? Well, I was looking in the archives, and in the first draft of this History of Communications manuscript, there's a short chapter about the pulp and paper industry in Canada. So there it is, undisputed. That was going to be in there, right? That there was the connection. That in fact he was going to take the pulp and paper industry writ large and talk about it on a more global scale. But that didn't appear in the volume. You know, it wasn't included in the next draft. But anyway, that was there. So this manuscript then.